Good evening. Welcome, everyone. My name is Billy Weitzer. I'm the Executive Director of the Leo Baeck Institute, and I welcome you to the Center for Jewish History for this event celebrating the publication of A Place They Called Home. This is a collection of essays about descendants of those who were deprived of their German citizenship, reclaiming that citizenship. It's a collection of essays that was edited by Dina Romero, who is a part of our panel tonight, and published by Berlinica Press, which is run by Eva Schweitzer, who is also here tonight and is selling books in the back. Did you want to say something more? She'll be, if you didn't hear that, she's here. She'll be here after the program and selling this book and others by her press. For those of you who don't know us, LBI's mission is to preserve and promote the history and culture of German-speaking Jewry. And tonight's event most definitely supports our work. This history is rich with lessons about migration, assimilation, accomplishment, prejudice, and resilience. And these essays are about that and more. Our catchphrase is keeping the past present, and there's a lot in the present that we can learn from this past. To add a historical layer to the program, we've asked David Sorkin, the Lucy G. Moses Professor of Modern Jewish History at Yale University, to join the panel. David also is the chair of LBI's Academic Advisory Board. He's currently working on a book about the history of the emancipation of the Jews in Europe. I think that his work is very important to an understanding of how German Jews identified with their country and what role citizenship plays in the relationship with Germany. We have a full program this evening. David Sorkin will speak first, then Dina Romero will speak. We will then have a Q&A session that will open up to a broader dialogue with the panel, but also there are several authors of the chapters here, and we ask that they trend towards the front of the auditorium so we can also ask them questions, and you'll be able to ask questions of them as well. So I'm looking forward to it, and thank you very much.
Good evening. It's good to see all of you here. Thank you, Billy, for the introduction. My aim this evening is to put the contemporary return of Jews to Germany in historical perspective. Because of the brutal and savage enormity of the Holocaust, the destruction of German Jewry, an emancipated, affluent, and vibrant community of over 500,000, the return of Jews today may seem like a singular event, a phenomenon without precedent or parallel. In fact, the opposite is the case. It belongs to a larger pattern. It has both precedents and parallels. To understand those precedents and parallels, we must take a long view of history, reaching back almost 1,000 years, but in fact emphasizing the last 2 or 3 centuries. To point to these precedents and parallels, I'd like to look at events under 2 headings: migration and citizenship. First, migration. What I'd like to emphasize is that there has been migration too, migration within and migration out of the German lands by Jews for over 1,000 years. It is a constant and recurring phenomenon. Jews first came to the German lands as early as the 9th century. It was in fact the first diaspora Jewish settlement outside of the Mediterranean basin and the Middle East. But that settlement was characterized by a constant coming and going. In the 11th century, during the Crusades, Jews were attacked and many moved eastwards. Many returned to the German lands and migrated to other German lands in the 13th and 14th centuries. In the 15th and 16th centuries, Jews continued to move eastward to the Polish and later Polish lands and later the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, or in the German lands, they migrated to minor territories or suburbs of cities. And from this point onwards, in fact, rural Jews predominated. There were only urban settlements from the 15th and 16th century in three areas: Frankfurt am Main, Worms, and Friedberg. In the century surrounding the Reformation, from approximately 1470 to 1570, Jewish life in the German lands virtually collapsed. There were expulsions prior to the Reformation, led by towns and the lower clergy, and there were expulsions during and after the Reformation, led mostly by princes and ecclesiastical authorities, which were far more systematic. The origins of modern German Jewish communities lay in the 17th century, around the 1648 Peace of Westphalia, but also during the religious wars that the Peace of Westphalia put an end to. Even then, there were continuing migrations in all directions. Poland was partitioned at the end of the 18th century, Prussia taking the northwest area that came to be called Posen. There was, in fact, constant migration of Jews from Posen into other parts of Prussia, especially Berlin and other major cities. To take just one well-known figure, Leo Beck himself came from Posen to Berlin. Between 1815 and the 1860s, the majority of Jews who migrated to the United States came from the German lands, particularly from Bavaria, where there were quotas on marriage and settlement. After the failed revolution of 1848, many German Jews who had been involved in the revolution left the German states for the United States, and in fact, the first trained rabbis came to the United States after that revolution. So the bulk of Jewish population in the United States to 1870 came from the German lands. In the 19th century, there was migration within the German states. There was urbanization as Jews moved from villages to small towns, from small towns to small cities, from cities to the major metropolitan areas. So that it was only after 1870 that the majority of Jews were actually concentrated in the major cities. And during the Great Migration of East European Jews from 1870 to 1914, during which 2 to 2.5 million Jews left Eastern Europe, almost 100,000 Jews came to the now unified Germany, especially from the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Finally, between 1933 and 1940 or 41, from Hitler's rise to power until the gates were closed, some 60% of German Jews left Germany. Now, if all this coming and going of migration in, migration within, migration out of Jews in the German lands has made you feel dizzy or vertiginous, then you've understood it. Migrating to, migrating in, and migrating out was a constant phenomenon. Migrating to Germany today is part of a millennium-long history. My second theme, citizenship. Like migration, citizenship was not stable, but constantly in flux. Emancipation, or gaining equality or rights, was a recurring process. It was not linear or one-time. For example, Jews first gained rights in the German lands during the Napoleonic period, between 1806 and 1812. In French-occupied lands, such as the Kingdom of Westphalia, they gained full rights. In lands allied with France, such as Baden and Bavaria, they gained partial rights. And in states competing with France, such as Prussia, they gained partial, though extensive rights, in that case in 1812. But with the Congress of Vienna in 1815, Jews lost their rights. The German states failed to unify, and in failing to unify, they failed to adopt uniform legislation giving Jews rights in all German states. Again, the Revolution of 1848 gave rights to all Germans regardless of religion, but then the revolution failed, and once again Jews lost rights. In 1870-71, with the unification of Germany, Jews gained rights or equality at the federal level, but many state constitutions which remained in place continued to discriminate on the basis of religion, identifying themselves as Christian states and therefore excluding Jews from civil service positions, which included teachers, professors, and army officers. In 1919, with the establishment of the Weimar Republic, Jews gained full rights. Between 1933 and 1942, the Nazis deprived Jews first of political rights. The Nuremberg laws were about political rights, then of civil rights, then of residence, and finally of their lives. Rights were restored by the American occupation forces on September 20th, 1945, and by West Germany's Basic Law of 1949. If we look at the situation of Jews in Germany today, we can again see waves of migration. The Jewish community in Germany today consists of three distinct waves of migration. There was the post-war wave of Jews emerging from the DP camps and of German Jews who returned to Germany or emerged from hiding. The second wave of migration is from Israel. Israelis, mostly younger people seeking various kinds of educational or economic opportunities, or disaffected with Israel. The third group are Russian Jews who opted for Europe or Israel over Israel or the United States. Perhaps the fourth group are our topic this evening, American Jews of German Jewish heritage returning to reclaim that legacy. So, if we take a long historical view, today's return of Jews to Germany is part of an ongoing process. It is, of course, new, yet it is also very old. Thank you.
Thank you very much to the Leo Baeck Institute for hosting this event this evening. Thank you to Billy Weitzer. Thanks to David Sorkin for sharing the platform with me. Thanks to Eva Schweitzer for taking a chance on me and this book. And thanks to my 11 wonderful co-authors, many of whom are here this evening. Thanks to all of you for attending, and thanks to my family for all of their support. I'd like to start with something that happened back in 2012. My family had been living in Berlin for 2 years, but we had to return to Montana for an extended time due to an illness in our family. So we came back to Montana, and one day I was sitting in my living room having a chat with our rabbi, and I was telling him how much I missed Berlin and how I longed to go back to Berlin. Why, he asked me, why do you have such a strong connection to Germany? Well, I said, my connection stemmed from my early years at family gatherings around the supper table with my German Jewish relatives in Washington Heights. we would sit around for hours at a time and kibitz all the aunts and uncles and cousins and grandparents and enjoy my Nana Irma's roast chicken and Apfelkuchen. Is that the whole basis of your Jewish identity, he asked me. I was taken aback. I paused and I had to think about it for a few minutes. And then I said, well, yes, actually, that is the foundation of my Jewish identity. But then we moved to California when I was 8, and those childhood experiences came to an end, and they were not replaced with new experiences to nurture my connection to my heritage. We led a very secular life devoid of Jewish cultural and religious influences, and it often felt like there was something missing. So today, if I have to give one answer to the question about what reclaiming my German citizenship means to me, I would say this: it has given me something that links me to my German Jewish heritage. It can't replace what's gone from the past, but it holds promise for the future, for me, for my children, and for all those of us who have reclaimed our citizenship. In 2013, we moved back to Berlin, and I continued blogging and writing about my experiences, and I spent a lot of time reflecting on my citizenship and writing on that topic, and I started to hear from German Jews throughout the diaspora who reached out to me and wanted to share with me their own stories of return, their own stories of naturalization. And so that's how I got the idea for this book project. I thought, why just talk about my own story? Together, these stories have a very significant meaning. And I had a number of other goals with this book project. I wanted to document an overlooked aspect of the post-Holocaust Jewish experience. A great deal of attention is paid to the establishment of monuments, memorials, to the return of stolen art, to the payment of financial reparations, but very little attention of a comprehensive nature has been paid to this form of restitution, restoring German citizenship. I wanted to contribute to the discourse on reconciliation. I wanted to complement the focus on remembrance with a focus on moving forward. We must not forget the victims, but we must also find a way to move forward from a traumatic past, as difficult as that is to do, but it becomes more essential as time goes by. And this was an important theme of this book. I also wanted to empower individuals to tell their own stories and to diversify the narrative about the Jewish experience, to show the world that the Jews are not just victims, they're not just fighting against anti-Semitism, and they're not just being pursued by their oppressors, that they are taking positive steps to lead normal lives around the world, including in Germany. And finally, I wanted to explore how the German Jewish citizenship experience is relevant for the integration of minorities, migrants, and refugees into German society. There are commonalities to our experiences and our interests, and I feel that it's important to have linkages with these groups and to find ways to pursue a better future. So, 3 years later, the book is coming out. What did I learn from this project? I felt it important to reflect on this today with all of you. I discovered that it's even more challenging than I imagined to find 11 co-authors and get them to place their trust in you and follow along on your journey to publish a book, especially if you've never published a book before. A lot of sweat went into the book, quite a few tears, but fortunately no blood was shed. I also discovered that There's a real synergy to the process of helping others to tell their stories. Although each story in this book is unique, together we have created a whole that is greater than the sum of its parts. Together we speak with a collective voice and say, it's good to be a German citizen again. I also learned that in our sometimes highly alienating digital age, it's possible to form enriching new relationships and a sense of community with people you have never met. Now, by today, I have met almost all of my co-authors. There are still a couple I haven't met, but let me mention those who are here this evening. Sally, an award-winning ballroom dancer and writer of exquisite prose, among other things. Dina, who graciously committed extra time to help with editing some of the stories and was always standing at the ready to help me. Carol, whose father was a child survivor of Theresienstadt and who I formed an instant bond with when we met in Berlin 2 years ago when she came with her father and her son. Peter, who endured a seemingly endless number of requests from Eva for a new author photo with very good humor, right? He had more picture takes than any of us. Maya, who represents the strength and renewal of the third generation and how we're moving forward. Kevin, who kindly endured my endless nudging and nudging and nudging to get his story down on paper. And he did it. And Sylvia, the last co-author who I found to contribute for the book, who showed a lot of patience and understanding with a very compressed deadline. Had to operate under a little bit more pressure than the 10 other co-authors. Yermi, Pippa, Nancy, and Ruth are not here this evening, but all incredible people who it was my pleasure to work with. So what's next? Although I don't plan to launch another book project with 11 co-authors, my goal has always been to share my experiences about being Jewish in Germany with an American audience. I plan to continue to do this through my writing and public speaking. As a German citizen, I also have an interest in fostering a robust civil society in which non-native Germans, whatever their religious, ethnic, or cultural background, can make Germany their Heimat, their home. Most of the contributors to this book are in agreement with me that if there are royalties, and Eva is standing at the ready to sell you books, we will donate our proceeds for such a cause. I've made a personal commitment to not profit financially in any way from this book. So thanks to all of you for your interest in this topic and in the book, and I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you, David and Donna. And I'm going to try to start again at the broad level back with David and then move to the more specifics with Donna. And so a question first about migration, David, and then another one about citizenship. You talk about the in and the out. Can you drill down a little bit? And because sometimes the in was coming towards something and sometimes it was running away from something. So the factors that influence these different migration waves, right? I mean, sometimes they were running away from pogroms and other times were they attracted to some opportunity? I mean, do you have any observations about that? There's a microphone right there.
That's a good question, Billy. Let me just take one example. For example, in 1671, 50 Jewish families are invited to settle in Berlin. They're invited in actually for a period of 20 years. It's not clear that the 20 years could be renewed, and with the stipulation that they not build a synagogue. Those families had been expelled from Vienna, and Prussia was in general inviting in colonists to its sparsely populated lands. These were wealthy merchants with lots of commercial experience, lots of contacts, and established trade routes, and so they came to Berlin. Yes, they were expelled from Vienna, and they came to Berlin, and they ended up staying.
So a push and a pull. And then on the topic of citizenship, I would assume that a lack of citizenship deprives minority of rights, but I would also gather that in your research that citizenship does not necessarily ensure minority rights. Is that correct?
Well, you know, the relationship between citizenship and minority rights really only applies to the 20th century. Minority rights were invented at the end of the 19th century as part of an attempt to restructure European land empires, particularly the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and some people thought that national minority rights could also be used to restructure Tsarist Russia. But they were never, the idea of minority rights was never applied to Jews in Germany. Even after the Nuremberg laws, Jews were not stateless or considered to be a minority that the League of Nations could actually deal with at that point, because they were deprived officially of political rights, and the Nazis created a new category of state membership without the ability to vote or hold office. Of course, racial segregation also was introduced at the same time. And I can't help but adding that when the Nazis were considering racial segregation, they sent a delegation to the United States in 1934 and 1935, which toured the southern states and studied the Jim Crow laws. And the Jim Crow laws were the basis for the Nuremberg racial laws.
Yes, a very important point. Donna, I know at the end of your book you document a little bit about the size of this phenomenon. I don't know if from the top of your head or not you can talk about that so we understand the size, the scale of this phenomenon.
Sure. The data that I gathered was from the year 2000 on, because that's all that's available. So approximately 50,000 applications for restored German citizenship have been approved since the year 2000. So it's a relatively small number, but I always say when we're having a conversation about German Jews, let's not just focus on the number. One important thing to keep in mind is that German citizenship law is based on descent and based on blood, not based on where you're born, as in the United States. So for every person who has their German citizenship restored, their descendants will automatically become German citizens and citizens of the European Union.
Right. So something a lot more substantive is you distinguish in your introduction German responsibility from victim reconciliation and a call to taking well, let me start again. So the German responsibility is one thing, but you call taking citizenship restorative justice. Do you remember saying that?
I think so.
Yeah. Do you want to say what you mean by that?
Well, it's there are a lot of different terms that can be used. Restitution, restorative justice. I probably use them somewhat synonymously. One of the things that I did comment on in the introduction is that there's a lot of focus on the perpetrator side and what's been done by the German government in order to make amends and to address the legacy of the Holocaust. And I thought it was really important to document from the other side, from the victim side, what does it mean to reconcile, and how does getting your citizenship back for your family contribute to moving forward into a future, not where you've forgiven, not where everything's perfect, but where you find a way to move forward and to coexist in hopefully a constructive and positive way. And you see that happening in many ways in Germany today, but it's not reported on because we read much more about, I know I'm going on a tangent now, but incidents of anti-Semitism than we do about the return of normal Jewish life to Germany.
Well, that was actually that was great. That's actually what I wanted to hear. But I was going to go off on that tangent too. Okay, so restorative justice, you're a citizen, you live in Berlin. You must be asked a lot about, as you are a German-American Jewish family in Berlin, but Germany, like much of Europe, has a rise of right-wing nationalism in the form of the AfD party. You talked in your comments about working towards a civil society. You must get asked a lot about it, and I'm sure people here would like to hear about how you respond to the situation in Germany.
Sure. The alternative for Germany, the AfD, is an extreme right-wing party that has very strong anti-immigrant views, anti-Semitic views, racist views, and they get an extraordinary amount of public attention, and they've done very well in state elections and the most recent federal elections, so they now have representation in all the states in Germany as well as in the Bundestag. However, their support has stabilized, and the support for the Green Party is also on the rise in Germany. And I think what's often overlooked is that Germany has a very strong political center, in my opinion, unlike perhaps what the U.S. has now in the Trump era. And I have a lot of faith in the citizenry in Germany. They have supported Angela Merkel, even though she's been through a rough ride with the migrant and refugee crisis, because she's a pragmatic leader, and Germans are pragmatic people. And I think for the most part, they don't want to repeat a horrific past. And there's just a very solid support for the social democratic system that exists in Germany. And in the most recent state elections that have taken place in Germany, you're not seeing the AfD getting any higher numbers. In fact, they've gone down a little bit.
Yeah, it's. I don't know, David, if you follow this, have any thing to add, but it is quite remarkable how Germany has responded to this compared to some of the neighboring countries, and as you say, the United States, which, because we're a two-party system versus a six-party system, the divide is different.
And almost every AfD demonstration, you see the counter demonstrators are 3 or 4 times larger in number.
Before we broaden it to audience questions as well as I want to talk to the contributors, and before I talk to the contributors, I want to introduce Kat Roher and Gil Lebanon, who produced a documentary film, Return to the Fatherland. And because one of the questions that I want to ask all the authors, but will first ask them, is what are the views of your parents or grandparents, survivors, of this decision to reclaim citizenship? And that is in essence what their film is about, which is having a viewing tomorrow. They'll give you the details if anybody wants to go see it. But meanwhile, I'd like them to answer a little bit about how their film sheds light on that question.
Hello, hi.
Stand up, so.
I'm Gil. I'm the Israeli part of the team, and this is Kat, my Austrian part of the team. We're very confusing, stereotypical. So I have a German. Thank you so much. First of all, I have a German citizenship since '96. The second I turned 16, my mom was like, "We're going," and it's one thing to get the citizenship. Now they're having really hard time with us, myself. I live in Vienna, and my sister's been living in Berlin for the past 10 years, living not in Israel. Second generation, at least in Israel, I'm not familiar with the US in that sense, is having a harder time letting the youngsters go, as opposed to the first generation who encourages them, which is fascinating. But that was one of our main shocking revelation while making the film. Yeah.
So you're talking about first generation being your grandparents.
Survival. Yes, my
Yeah.
grandfather.
So just tell you a little bit more about. I mean, there's a lot about the relationship between grandparents and young people in Vienna and Berlin.
About the film.
In the film, yeah.
So our film deals with a third generation who decide to move back to former Nazi regime countries, Austria and Germany, and how do their grandparents handle this move. What we also did was include our story because Kat comes from one side and I come from the other side, and we're both third generation. Would you like to? Yeah, you should come sit in. So we have 3 couples of a grandfather, a grandma, and the grandkid, and we go through a journey with them, and we talk a lot about a lot of things, including state of Israel and where is it going, yeah, and what it means to be Jewish in Germany now, when the world is so crazy.
Great. Well, thank you. And there's some flyers in the outside.
Yeah, it's
Oh,
tomorrow at 7 at the JCC. I
Right.
think there's still tickets available.
Right. And they're flyers, and then it's showing.
It's going to be in theaters in the spring, probably. This is a special preview screening, and we'll hopefully have it in theaters in New York and hopefully other cities around the country. We just screened in Austria and did a tour in Germany, and super interesting. So if you can't make it tomorrow, back to thefatherland.com, but there's also flyers out there, and we'll update our schedule regularly.
Great. And I'd like to ask the same question of any one of the contributors to the book. Your interaction with G1 or G2, and if you're G3, whatever. Your interactions with people when you said, family members, I'm going to go do this. Was it bravo or why or something in between? Who would like to contribute? And identify yourself, please, when you do.
Hello, I'm Dina Romero, and my conversation was really in my head. I'm first generation, and both my parents are deceased. So I had to go through the process of thinking what my father would have said. Fortunately, I'm writing a history, a family history, and have been reading my father's letters and know that he came to the States in 1938 and for a long period of time was a stateless person. So I decided that having another citizenship would not only be a good idea, but that my father would have approved. He was a great advocate of having security in your life when he went through a period of not having very much security at all. It was a big struggle for him when he started. And also he believed in having options. And I figured he would be very pleased if I had this option in my life. And of course, the other drawing card that Donna mentioned is that it was something that I could pass on to my son and grandchildren, giving them options. So as I say, I hope I've not been too long-winded, it was a conversation I had to have in my head. And I decided my father would have approved. Thanks.
Thank you. Other contributors that want to comment on conversations in their head or in reality with other family members, siblings, parents?
Thanks. Hi, my name is Joe Wolf Herman, and my mother was quite elderly, but I have to echo exactly what was said. My father especially would have, he was deceased at the time, but he would have approved of having an option to go elsewhere if needed. And it wasn't an easy choice. It wasn't like, oh yeah, this is great. There were lots of conflicts, but in the end, forgive me, given some political changes in the United States, I decided that having an option was a good thing to do. I'll add an irony if I'm not being too long-winded. The irony is that my father, his family came from a very small town in Thüringen, not so far from Eisenach, which was the nearest town that anyone might know of. But the town had grown, Bergfeld, Ansvera, the town had grown to all of 3,000 people at the time that he left it to go to medical school in Berlin. He did a family history. He went to the Jewish graveyard, assuming that everybody Jewish in this little town was related somehow. Isn't it interesting that the oldest gravestone was 1555? Why did Jews start showing up and dying in a town in central nowhere in Germany in 1555? And the proposed answer is, well, maybe 1492, but it can't be proven. Thus, yes, it's always good to have options.
So I think we have another author who wants to tell the story. Sorry, we'll get you the mic.
Hi, I'm Maya. I guess I'm also representing the second generation here. So the conversations in my family were interesting because by the time we got around to applying for the citizenship and getting the citizenship, the actual survivors in my family had all passed. And we know a bit about what my grandfather thought because my brother, who started the ball rolling in my family, had a short conversation with my grandfather almost immediately prior to when he died, and his reaction was very sort of, let's talk about this later. And then he died. So we never had the conversation. But with my grandmother on the other side of my family, who was not a survivor and her family came from a different place, she still to this day doesn't quite get it. Because to her, in her mind, and she is of this generation, she's in her 90s now, Germany is a very bad place. It's like the way we kind of think of North Korea. And if we think of North Korea in like 50 years from now, imagine that it's, opened up to the world and it's a vibrant place and it has a democracy and all this, and suddenly people are wanting to go back. That might sound kind of odd to a lot of us. And so she still is constantly questioning me about, like, why do you live there? What is it like there? Do you have friends? Legitimately, I think she thinks I sit around in my apartment doing nothing, which sometimes I do. But yeah, it's very confusing to her, and it's very, on a certain level, disturbing, I think, which, I understand, but also makes me sad that she doesn't She can't see the new way that Germany is in a lot of ways, and the new people who are there that have grown up with the Holocaust as history and have learned about it and have, in many ways, atoned for what has happened. And I'm just one person, but I personally have had wonderful experiences living in Germany, have not experienced any anti-Semitism, and can say wonderful things about many different aspects of the country. So it's been a push and a pull in my family.
That's actually a perfect segue to the second question I want to ask the authors, and then we'll turn it over to the audience to ask questions. But how has reclaiming citizenship changed your views of Germany? So would anyone who wrote a chapter like to comment about that? Oh, you want to answer the old question? Go ahead. I'm sorry. That's fine too. Free choice.
Kevin Hale, and I guess first generation. So, the responses to these questions, I think, are essentially a great advertisement for this book, because I think every one of us has. We really want. I think it could speak for hours. It's so complicated and so fraught, and that with Donna's encouragement, we were able to distill it into a few dozen pages. It's quite a thing. So both of my parents. My father is 96, he sends his greetings, and my mother, who passed away, were from different parts of Germany, and were fortunate to escape legally, so to speak, in early 1939. And they both married other refugees, so all of my cousins had the same heritage. And I would say, in response to the first question, that the relationship to Germany is really across the board. One part of the family where, German was spoken and familiarity, and another in which I think why would anyone ever want to set foot in that place? So in my family, my parents, curious, went back to visit for the first time in 1975. I was 14. And came to this conclusion. I mean, they were, of course, quite traumatized by the whole experience up to Kristallnacht and escaping and being refugees, was that it was a new generation, and the fact that there was McDonald's in Hamburg meant a great deal to my father. Right. So for myself, it was really a sense of knowing history, and that, as Professor Sorkin said, there are many times in which things that throughout the history of Germany and elsewhere, there were destructions and then rebuilding. And as the 70th anniversary of my parents' escape was approaching, so 2008, I had really a couple of thoughts. And one is a whole generation has passed, and the other was related, well, why give up this claim to this place? And but I have to say that when I asked my father how he felt about it, he said, I don't have the slightest problem with it. So it wasn't approval, it wasn't that's great, it wasn't have options, it's actually fine with me. And maybe it was that German pragmatism. In my own experience, I found it to be about exploring the question of what is this thing that's called German? And the conclusion is that it's a constructed identity, and it was changing even as my grandparents became German. It took about 10 years to finally go through with it, and what it really was our son, who was doing a semester abroad, understanding that he could study without a student visa, and in that generation, it's more pragmatic, and for me, it's what was that all about? I will conclude with, in my essay, it was part of a trip to Germany, first time I traveled with my passport, and I was visiting my son, who was working at a farming community, and they asked him, now that you have German citizenship, you're going to move here, right? And his response was, no, I have no interest in that. And I think that we're sort of allowing for the possibility that this citizenship is not also directly tied to the intention to live there, and that's a challenging question. And I also apologize for going on.
No, that was great. Is he an author?
I am now the first among the audience, and I'm going to present Germany the way it is, a total different angle. You have been witnessed for the last 70 years with the penetration of Islam in Western Europe, and they are creating now such huge problems, including Germany. And I disagree that Angela Merkel was pragmatic and a social democrat. Only 3 years ago, in 2015, she declared in the German parliament that Islam is part of Germany, full part of Germany. Now you have movements, right-wing movements, unfortunately, because of these issues, because the people presented, the various governments in the last 70 years, they showed 100% tolerance.
Excuse me, so I'm happy to turn to audience questions, but would you turn it into a question?
Well, this is extremely important to see what the reality of the Germany is nowadays, which is a different angle, because you have right-wing movements in Austria, in Italy, which were part of Europe, and Eastern Europe, former communist countries, and you have everywhere neither right-wing, and I am very, very afraid it's going to end up in a blood.
Okay, well, let's thank you, but let's move on to people that have a question.
I don't have a question, I have
Okay.
this statement, and
Okay.
we have to look at this also.
Okay.
Thank you.
Questions, please.
Yeah, for both speakers, I have definition questions. With regard to migration, Germany wasn't Germany before 1870. So when you speak of migration in and out, and the German borders changed a lot, so it doesn't make sense to me. That it seems more like migration within. So my question is, what is migration for you? How you define it? Second, migration, that's how do you come to define it as a migration? In your last remarks, the people who were in concentration camps and German and came back to their houses, how can you call that a migration? That is a very strange definition for me, so I really would like for you to comment on that. Definition questions for you. You used the word moving forward a couple of times, but your definition of moving forward is integration, living in Germany. Well, I'm German. I grew up in Berlin. I went the other way. I came to the United States 30 years ago. I see the political situation very differently from you. The center actually has disintegrated. AfD started 2013, is now in all state governments, but I don't want to make a statement. But moving forward can equally be saying, I do not want to live in Germany, I want to move away. So you have a very specific definition of using forward, and I would ask you, how do you define moving forward?
Okay, so defining migration, defining moving forward.
Yes, thank you for the question about migration. In talking about Germany before 1870, I tried to be careful to say German lands rather than Germany. To be more historically precise, I should have perhaps talked about the Holy Roman Empire, but since I was limited to 15 minutes, I thought I would just make a distinction between the German lands before 1870 and unified Germany after 1870. So I think one of the things that I tried to emphasize was this constant movement. One of the things that's important to keep in mind about Germany before 1870, let's say in the 17th or 18th century, is just how fragmented the German lands were. You know, the lands that came to be unified Germany in 1870, in the 17th and 18th century, consisted of over 300 separate polities. Napoleon reduced that to 36. And then in 1870, you have a unification. But the fact is that migration was encouraged by the very fact that you had so many different states and dukedoms and bishoprics, so that if Jews didn't get the conditions they wanted in one polity, or they were being discriminated against in one polity, they could pick up and move to another one. Migration or mobility for Jews was a form of power. If you didn't like where you were, you could pick up and leave, right? And then you asked a question about Jews returning from survivors returning to Germany after the war, and I talked about that as a wave of migration. No, I don't see that as cynical at all, because after all, the choice to return to Germany was a conscious, deliberate choice, right? And to return and settle in Germany was a conscious choice. And in that sense, it's not unlike migration. Migration is usually a deliberate choice. So that's why I use that term.
Moving forward.
Moving forward to me means finding a way to live and get along with former adversaries. So, our mother, my sister is here, she can confirm this, did not want to ever speak German, did not want to have anything to do with Germany. There was no discussion about family history in our household when we were growing up. There was no discussion about the Holocaust. Moving forward means moving beyond that stage. And this is why my writing and my work is so much directed towards American Jews seem particularly resistant to recognizing the change that has taken place in Germany. And I am not saying that there is no anti-Semitism in Germany, but to the gentleman who spoke earlier, 85 to 90% of anti-Semitic incidents are not committed by refugees or immigrants from other countries. They are committed by Germans. That is the root there. So we need to form common cause with groups that are also in a minority status in order to work towards a better society. And I think the Jews in Germany often forget that because we're so focused on ourselves and our victimhood, and we don't realize that our future is contingent on the future of these other groups in German society.
Great. Well, thank you.
I think it's fair to say in the U.S., Jews have had a disproportionate impact in the arts, journalism, politics, academics. Can you say what sort of impact Jews in Germany are having today, if any, or are they sort of too newly reintegrated into the society?
Maybe we should start with the historical impact, no? You want to go back in history? No? If you want. I just was thinking it might. Disproportionate impact.
I mean, what you said about Jews in the United States today was, of course, said about Jews in Germany from about the middle of the 19th century until the Nazis came to power. Jews were disproportionately represented in the professions, in various forms of culture. I mean, there are various explanations that have been given for that. One way to see it is that Jews were a disproportionate part of the educated German middle classes. In fact, one could argue, and some historians have tried to point to have pointed to this, is that Jews became almost a model for the emergence of the German bourgeoisie in the 19th century. They were sort of pioneers of the emergence of the German Bürgertum, the urban educated middle classes. You can see it just in terms of demographics. Which group started to limit family size in order to maximize educational opportunities for their children? It was Jews who started to have 2 and 3 children rather than 6 or 8 or 10. If you look at the way in which Jews use the educational system, many Jews use the educational system as a form of social mobility. Whereas for the for German society in general, the educational system was often used as a way of reinforcing already attained privilege. So I can't give you an overall historical explanation. It's far too complicated a phenomenon.
No, we know.
I know, but I'm talking about before.
We're going to get there because one thing that I'd like to say in our work is similarities are very useful, as are differences, right? And this is a great story about Germans. It's very applicable, as you pointed out, to Americans too. And I think, I don't know if Donna or whoever wants to speak about Germany today, but I think the answer has to be divided into 3 parts. The 80% that are former Soviet, the 10% that are Israeli, and the 10% that came to Germany in the late 1940s and early 50s. And their experiences and their accomplishments are all quite distinct, I would say. I don't know if you want to comment.
Yeah, I would just add briefly that you're never going to have a German Jewry in Germany today that's the same type of population that we had before the Holocaust. It's a different German Jewry, and Jewish arts and culture are alive and well in Germany, but yeah, it's of a different flavor because the population is made up of a different Jewish people.
Right, but I also, from my experience, of course this will be a generalization, but I mean a lot of young Israelis are attracted and they're doing a lot in the arts. That a lot of the German Jews that came out of the war kept their heads very low, right, in terms of involvement in public aspects, right? So there are some trends, but they're very different, and you have to look at the different populations. So.
Hopefully I'm not speaking out of turn and you've actually moved to the audience participation part. So I have a question. A lot of your comments about citizenship implied residency. And Rabbi Hale made the comment about his son that I thought was particularly relevant. I got my dad's citizenship back, my German citizenship back in 1993 while living in Hong Kong. And for me it was a very practical thing. I can go through the shorter line at the airport. My kids all did a junior year abroad without needing a visa. And I'm curious, you cited statistics about the number of people who've applied for German citizenship. Is there a study for how many people fall into the category that I and Rabbi Hale's son fall in, that it's a practical matter? I'm an American citizen, I live here, I happen to have a German second passport that I use as a convenience, but I have no intention, at least until there's a big change here, no intention of actually needing to rely on it. But the security issue is there, and my dad was very, very clear maintaining a European bank account and reclaiming his citizenship after his own children did. I'm wondering if there's data on people who fall into the citizenship without residency category.
I'm not familiar with any data on that, but I'm fairly certain that the vast majority of people who reclaim their German citizenship do not move to Germany. So a lot of my remarks were related to my own personal story because my family did move to Germany. However, reclaiming German citizenship gives you membership in Germany as well as in the European Union, and that is passed down to your descendants. And I think that has significance for how you function in society as a political and civil being. And I think there are ways that that contributes to your consciousness, your identity, and your understanding of the world that are significant. But how you measure that, you know, it's something very soft. And as I think Kevin did mention, it does give you options. So many people told me, yes, I'm not planning on coming back. I'm monitoring the political situation, but it hasn't come to that yet. But that doesn't mean there won't be a time in the future when they make that decision. So I think it is part of a process of reconciliation. Even if you're making the choice for practical reasons, you wouldn't be doing it if you had the same feeling that our mother had and many other people of that generation. So yeah, I don't want to overstate my theme. So part of my comments are related to my personal story.
I have the feeling that the story that you're telling, all three of you, is a different story from the story that Jews get reading the New York Times and Commentary magazine or tablet or whatever it is that Jews in this country read. You're not telling the same story about the sources of anti-Semitism. You're not telling the same story. And it's curious that Jews are not achieving any kind of prominence in Germany. It seems like a very laid back, coming back to something that's very, it's a very amorphous kind of thing that you're presenting.
I would have to disagree about that what we're presenting is so different from what you read in the press. I mean, there's a wide variety of views in the press. A lot of what I've gotten is from going to Germany, but also reading in the press. And I'd also say, we weren't saying that Jews haven't accomplished, but I think there are, there are sociological and cultural and psychological barriers that they have to address, how prominent they want to be. And when you think of how young the former Soviet population is, they've got a lot of infrastructure to build. So there's been a lot of nest building, let's say. So I think it's too soon to evaluate what their participation will be. Did you want to?
I guess I'm not quite sure what was behind that question, but my reading, I would agree with what you said, that I don't think the stories are being told, and that is part of my goal, as I said in my comments, is to diversify the narrative about the Jewish experience. And I think there's a little bit of resistance in the media to accepting that there is a normalization of Jewish life in Germany and in Europe, despite the fact that there are problems as well.
So I became Belgian because my parents came here in the 40s and they moved back, and I grew up there and then I came back. I became Belgian only 8 years ago. So it's a different subject, but my question is, it was a very difficult process. You claim that as an American it's easy to become German. I wonder if they differentiate between different countries where you apply for citizenship, or all German, all families from German ancestry automatically, or do you think they discriminate being American or coming from different places? That's the first question. The second question is, Spain and Portugal also are inviting Jews to come back. I belong to the Spanish-Portuguese synagogue here, and they advertise as such. My husband, who's Sephardic, is trying to do it. It's a very difficult process. Being American, even, it's very difficult. The Portuguese seem to be a little bit more lenient than the Spanish government. So my question is, do you think that the government has changed their way of accepting Jews lately, or it's the same as it was in the 90s, or recently? Is it the same as it used to be, as easy to reclaim?
Well, that's a really good question, and it's an opportunity for Sylvia to jump in and comment on her application or lack thereof. So the process of applying, if you're eligible, is very simple. If your family member was persecuted on political, racial, or religious grounds between 1933 and the end of the war and fled, then that individual and their descendants are eligible to reclaim their citizenship. And it's a very simple application, 2 pages, and you provide all those supporting documents, birth, marriage certificates, etc. However, there are a few eligibility exceptions, one of which Sylvia fell into, and so I think it would be best to have her talk about that. But the way in which the law is enforced is very, very rigid. It's not actually enforced in the spirit of restitution. I think the Article 116, paragraph 2, that was added to the Basic Law in 1949 was done in that spirit, but the bureaucrats in the Bundesverwaltungsamt in Cologne, they take a very rigid approach to evaluating the applications. And so if they determine that you don't meet the criteria, they're not going to cut you a break. That's Germany for you.
Although I've got a contribution in the book, in fact, it turns out that I'm not eligible for citizenship.
Could you put your mouth closer to the mic?
Sorry?
Louder.
Closer. Oh. Is this okay? Can you hear? Okay. I fall through several gaps, in fact. The first one is that my father was an Italian Jew, and I'm not entitled to Italian citizenship because he naturalized, both my parents naturalized when my mother was pregnant, specifically so that I would guarantee to be British, because my parents weren't American. They fled to England. Can you hear me? And like this. Okay. I'm not American. So my father was Italian, but had naturalized before I was born, and the Italian law is that he would have had to have still been Italian when I was born. So I wasn't entitled to Italian citizenship. I'm not entitled to German citizenship. The first reason, because I was born before '53, and my father wasn't German. But I've lived in Germany and I speak fluent German, so I was told that I did qualify through another law, which entitles you if your mother was persecuted by the Nazis and you have a strong relationship with Germany. But I discovered after my piece had gone and the book had gone to press that I'm not entitled to that either, because I would for that have had to have been born in 1949, and I was born in 1948. A group has convened in England, but there are several people from the States as well who fall through various loops. There's another category of people whose ancestors were perceptive enough before 1933 to have escaped. They foresaw what was going to happen, and they're deemed to have left voluntarily. Then there's one member who was adopted by German refugees, and because it's not a bloodline, she doesn't qualify because adoption doesn't count. And there are various other loopholes as well. So it's not at all simple, in fact, unless you qualify very clearly in answer to your question. And I think each country has its own law. I think there are a couple of countries where you don't qualify if your father fought in the army of a country that was an enemy of Germany during the Second World War. Donna probably knows more about this than I do. But there are lots of loopholes.
Thank you for that explanation. We're going to have time for one more question, and then there'll be plenty of time to talk at the reception afterwards. Joel?
If I may, Joel Levy, I'm the former president of the Center for Jewish History, and I was an American diplomat in Berlin for 4 years, and then the founding chairman for Germany of the Ronald Lauder Foundation, which is training rabbis in Germany today. And just on the question that was asked before about the prominence of Jews in Germany, the numbers are very important. At the time we arrived in Germany in 1992, there were about 25,000. Today that number has grown. Estimates are about 200,000, which is about 0.25% of the population of Germany. So we shouldn't expect large numbers of prominent Jews. But I would point out that a board member of the Leo Baeck Institute, Joe Jaffe, is the publisher of Die Zeit, which is probably the most prestigious intellectual paper in Germany. I would point out Daniel Barenboim is the director of the Berlin Philharmonic. I would point out that there are hundreds and hundreds of young Israeli and Russian cultural people whose names are not yet known to me or to anybody else, but who will be very, very prominent in the period that is before us. Just keep watching those names. I think that many of those people are contributing, particularly in Berlin, to that which makes it the most exciting city in Europe today. So I think there is something happening there. I'm not advocating that it's a good thing or that people ought to go and become German citizens, but I think it is a fascinating phenomenon, and the discussion this evening got to some of that, and I think you want to adjourn so we can continue individually. Thank you for giving me the floor.
Thank you, Joel. Thank you, Donna. Thank you, David. Great conversation. As I said, there will be opportunity over refreshments to continue the conversation. And Ava raced up there because she's got books for sale. And thank you again. It was great questions, great participation.